Hello, welcome to another episode of the Modern Cyber Podcast. For a change, we're actually recording in person for once, which I am excited for. And we're here with today's guest, Daniel Grzelak. Daniel, thanks so much for making the time to join us.
Appreciate it. Excited to do it.
Awesome. I've got a few things I want to get through today, but just before we kind of kick things off, why don't you start with a little background on yourself, what your current role is with Plerion, and then maybe some of the past few positions you've been in and kind of how you got into cybersecurity.
Okay. Well, I'm extremely weird.
Okay.
My current position is officially Chief Innovation Officer at Plerion, which is a cloud security company. And there I do mostly research and like technical security research and evangelism based on that research, and also trying to get some innovative stuff, differentiation into our product.
Yeah.
Before that, I was CISO at Linktree, and before that, head of security at Atlassian.
Yeah, okay. I mean, those are two organizations that are that I think of as being very cloud forward and operating at scale. So it must have been a lot of learning along those journeys and those stops along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Atlassian was the company that really introduced me to the cloud. Like Atlassian runs on AWS, and that's where I got started with learning everything I could about it.
Gotcha. It's really interesting. You know, some of the stuff that you guys have been doing recently on, I think AWS specifically, the last couple of posts that I've seen from Plerion around discoveries and findings that you've had in security research, I think have been AWS specific, right? For those who haven't seen the articles, there was one on kind of extracting account IDs, and then another one on extracting metadata of another type from instances or from tags, or remind me?
From policies.
From policies, right, okay. And so first of all, how did you find these things? And second of all, what led you to even go look for them?
So I'm not the kind of person that will find vulnerabilities in things like deep technical vulnerabilities. I'm just not smart enough for that.
Okay.
But I love figuring out how I can manipulate things like that work their intended way, but then you can get them to do something that's unintended and interesting.
Yeah.
So for example, with the policy one, where you could basically read another company's tags.
Yeah.
So tags are a way you organize your stuff. You put the department, etc. on a resource.
Yeah.
And the way that you can actually do that is by abusing an IAM policy in AWS. Because typically what you say is when you're accessing something, you can write a policy that checks something about you. Like your username or your department or something like that.
Yeah.
But in this case, there's also a couple of ways that you can check something about the thing that you're accessing.
Right.
And in this case, you could check, does it have the appropriate tag? And there's a special condition that...
Right, the IAM conditional statement. Yeah.
Exactly. There's a special condition where you can start matching things character by character. For instance, does the tag value start with an S?
Yeah.
And then does it start with an ST? And so on. And so you can enumerate the value of the tag.
And that's really interesting because I know from my own experience, and look, I started at AWS in 2010. In those days, there were no VPCs. Most companies had one AWS account. By the way, like everybody using the root user. There weren't really, there was no IAM. There wasn't a possibility for me to give a DG user versus a Jeremy user versus whatever, right? But tags were the main way that we, let's say, differentiated workloads from each other, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody's living in this one big control plane and network plane as well. And all we really had to go on to differentiate my instances in this mass fleet of EC2 from yours is tags. And so the reason I bring that up is that I think that habit of using tags to mark workloads and various things about the workloads continues to this day, but has also evolved in a way where I've seen companies storing secrets in tags and using, let's say, a boot script to read in the tags via the instance metadata calls. And that might give me an API key that then I, go use to access a bucket or something. So there's actually like potentially valuable information that you could extract or enumerate from this.
Yeah, so AWS explicitly says in a big red box in their documentation, do not put confidential information in tags. They're just meant to be organizational elements.
Yeah.
Like we talked about department, whatever.
Yeah. Billing code, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. But you're right. We've seen customers put secrets in there. The one mitigating factor probably is, well, two really. One is you have to know the name of the tag.
Okay.
So if the tag is called something really obscure, it's very hard to find unless it's in code somewhere and you find it.
But AWS secret key is not a super obscure tag name.
Sure, or password or something.
Exactly, yeah.
The other thing is the resource has to be accessible by the attacker.
Okay.
In some way.
Okay.
So for example, the most common and easiest example is if you make an S3 bucket accessible, let's say you publish your website on it, then now you can enumerate the tags of that
S3 bucket,
etc.
Yeah. But there's also situations where, for instance, and I think this maybe ties to the second piece of your research, the marketplace relationships and establishing something of a trust relationship between account A and account B in order for me to sell you something via the AWS marketplace. Would that make resources available for query or not so much?
So one of the other ways that you can expose a resource is allowing a role to be assumed.
Right.
So if you can assume a role into someone else's account, then you can enumerate the tags on it.
Yeah. And I feel like there's maybe more instances of that than people realize, considering the number of SaaS solutions that are designed to integrate with your AWS environment and probably do create these kind of trust relationships with assume role capabilities and two-way trust and things like that.
Exactly. And then it all depends on how you build your applications. If you expose a queue, there's all sorts of weird and wonderful assets that you intentionally expose through AWS.
Yeah. One of the interesting things, I mean, you made the point that there's this big red box that says, don't put secrets in tags. We've also known don't store passwords in text files on operating systems for a long, long time. But that happens, X thousands of times per day. I'm pretty sure not everybody either sees or heeds that warning about don't put secrets in tags.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely. This is just one of those almost like security behaviors that, training hasn't really broken through on.
So in general, I think what's happened with the AWS ecosystem is it's proved out that training and documentation don't work at scale. So if you think about the S3 problem, for a long time people were exposing S3 buckets through a variety of means, accidentally making them public, making them available to all authenticated
messed up bucket
users.
Policy, no IP restrictions, whatever, right?
And it was all documented. Don't do it this way. But the interface sort of led you down. That's the easiest way to do it. And eventually AWS took action at scale and really changed their user interface to make it all off by default, all blocked by default. And you had to really try very hard
to make a bucket public.
Exactly. Even though they had the documentation and even
and you've had 5 control mechanisms for 8 years now that can make a bucket non-public.
Exactly. And so I think this has been proven out again. Like the S3 example is just one. But it's been proven out over and over in AWS is if it's easy, people will just do it.
And the other place that I find that really kind of that this kind of like anti-security behavior manifests itself again and again is in debugging and troubleshooting, primarily in non-production environments, right? I'm a developer, I'm working on something, it's not working. I could painstakingly go through the IAM policy permission by permission to try to figure out what is blocking it, or I could grant myself star, get it to work again, and move on with life.
Absolutely. And now AWS has tools to help you do exactly that. IAM Access Analyzer will tell you which policy you need. But it's hard.
IAM is really, really hard. I mean, I was working at AWS when IAM was introduced. And I remember thinking at the time, like, oh, this is great. But then about a couple months later, I remember thinking, I don't know if we properly understood the complexity that we were about to unleash on the world. I say we like I had anything to do with it. That the IAM tool was about to unleash on the world and all the complexity. And there was there's a Slack community that I'm in where there was a great quote that I screenshotted a number of years ago. And it was something like, every time I work with IAM, I want to rip my hair out. I would pay somebody literally anything they asked for to make this problem go away.
The beautiful thing is you can pretty much do anything you want.
The
terrible thing is you can pretty much do anything you want.
So you guys have published these 2 articles. People can find those on the blog.plerion.com, or is it plerion.com/blog? I can't remember.
Blog.plerion.com.
Okay, good. And Plerion, Plerion, for those of you who are watching or listening. So do check that out. I'm curious, Plerion is maybe a couple years old as an organization right now?
A little bit older, but yeah.
Okay.
Young company.
Young company, and entering a cloud security space that, I started working in cloud security in 2016, and I would say at the time it was an early stage to work on cloud security. Customers generally didn't understand cloud security. Security teams that we went and talked to didn't understand cloud security. We would get a lot of questions like, where's my firewall? We would get a lot of questions like, what agent should I be installing on all of my instances? Things like that. And I would say that the understanding of cloud security is very different from what it was, 8 years ago. But by the same token, there's any number of companies in the cloud security space, and some of them very large, right? You've got the likes of Palo Alto with the Prisma Suite and Checkpoint and on and on and on down the list. So I'm really curious from your perspective, what makes Plerion different? What's different about the approach that you're taking towards cloud security?
Sure. So firstly, it starts with our mission, which is to simplify cloud security.
Okay.
One of the things we've already talked about is just how insanely complex IAM is.
Yeah.
But everything in the cloud is complex. AWS has hundreds of services.
Yeah.
No one person can possibly understand that.
And each service may have 10, 15, 20 configuration items, some of which, by the way, counteract each other.
Yep.
And, some have a default deny, but then an allow. And so yes, there's the complexity on the resource or service by service basis as well.
And then you've got the complexity of the stuff that you're building in the cloud. You've got the complexity of all the vulnerability management. And where's your data? What your permissions are? So it's just really complicated. It's a lot.
Yeah.
And what we found is that you log into a bunch, some of the older tools, and you'll just get a list of all the problems that you have.
Right.
And now you're expected to
do
figure
something
out
about
what
it.
to do. And what do you do?
Yeah.
I don't know. And so our mission is to simplify that process. And so help you get to the top things that you need to do today.
Okay.
Top things that you need to do after today.
Okay.
Like what's going to reduce your risk the most now, basically, and help customers along that journey to mature their cloud security presence.
And when you think about figuring out the things that are going to have the greatest risk reduction impact, I'm sure there's some secret sauce there, which I'm not going to ask you about. But I'm curious, do you look at it from the standpoint of what has the greatest blast radius, or what has the easiest fixability, or is it like some combination thereof, or how do you think about that prioritization question?
Right. So we use this concept of attack paths and assets at risk.
Okay.
So an asset at risk might be your production database, your customer database, your S3 bucket with something important.
My production RDS instance, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And then we build potential attack paths. So starting from the edge to, say, a vulnerability sitting inside a Lambda function that is accessible through API gateway. Okay. Now can that eventually, through trust relationships or through other things, go and touch that asset at risk or that data at risk? And if it can, then we want to break that chain, and we present that whole attack path to the user and give them an option to fix some part of it or break that chain in some way.
So that's really interesting, because breaking the chain is not a response that I've seen from a lot of solutions. What I've seen from a lot of solutions is like, okay, here's the attack path, here's all the implicated elements, maybe that vulnerability, maybe the IAM role that links the instance to the RDS, or maybe the ACL between VPC 1 and 2, whatever that thing is. But then it's really like up to the user to figure out what the remediation is and what the remediation steps they want to take is. Are you saying that you guys kind of like intelligently suggest the most effective remediation to the attack path, or how do you think about that? So
yes and no.
Okay.
Like we're still working on that part, but the thing we do is prioritize the things within that attack path. So you can see the vulnerabilities that are in that attack path, and you get the worst one at the top, for example, etc. And so we're still working on that part, but absolutely the idea is to make it super simple for the user, so they don't have to make decisions. They can, if they want to, they can see everything. And like maybe for their organization, it doesn't make sense to patch that vulnerability for a reason. Maybe they want to change the trust relationship between the Lambda and something else.
Trim down the IAM role, whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah, got it. I think that, to me, that sounds very much like not very much, but there are parallels to the vulnerability management problem that we as a cybersecurity industry have been trying to eliminate for like 20 plus years. I find it super depressing, by the way, that like 20 years ago when I started in IT, to kind of date myself, it's actually more like 25, but the average time that a vulnerability lived on a system was more than 6 months. And it's still the case. And I think that when I see organizations turn on vulnerability management for the first time, they're always overwhelmed by the number of vulnerabilities that exist in their environment. And they have no idea about how to figure out which ones that they need to tackle. Is that kind of, is there a parallel there in what you're doing in cloud security?
Yeah, exactly. So part of cloud security is vulnerability management of the stuff in the cloud. And so absolutely, we prioritize the assets at risks, and then we prioritize the vulnerabilities on those assets at risk.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot there that there's a lot of data that has to be correlated to kind of calculate that attack path, at least from my own understanding of AWS. So I think that's a really powerful solution, and probably something that a lot of organizations aren't going to immediately understand, like first time they see it. So when you think about walking somebody through that attack path, do you kind of go step by step explaining what's the link between step 1, step 2, step 3?
Yeah, absolutely. And they can see it visually.
Sure.
Yeah.
But they may not understand like how thing 1 connects to thing 2. Like why a non-obvious IAM role or a secondary set of permissions that is attached to an IAM user might accidentally create a secondary exposure that they were not aware of.
Yeah, exactly. So we describe all of the relationships. For example, if something might be accessible through a NACL.
Yep.
Right? And so we'll say that there's a network access available through this relationship.
Okay.
Another thing might be that a role can be assumed.
Okay.
And so we'll describe that relationship.
Okay.
But the idea over time is we make, again, going back to the simplicity, we want to make all of this simpler and simpler over time. So we abstract all of that complication and give the user the simplest explanation that they can get. And then if they want to, they can go dig into, they can press a button and see the policy and dig into it.
Yeah. And how do you think about automated remediation as part of this whole world? Like, is it something that you guys do, or is it something that you offer but customers have to turn on, or do you think like customers just aren't quite there yet?
It's something we discuss a lot.
Okay.
Whether we should offer it or not.
Yeah.
But so personally, I feel like it's a bit of an anti-pattern.
Okay.
So in principle, what we want to do is shift all of that stuff
to the left,
right?
Yeah.
Whether it's build the right policy at the start or make sure that the container doesn't get into the registry. Make sure that the vulnerable code isn't vulnerable in the first place.
Right, or never gets committed to prod.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And if it does, you want to find it and establish a baseline so that it never happens again. So like in principle, I think we want to, or you might build a service control policy to prevent that kind of thing ever again in the future. Yeah. And so it's sort of like if it does happen, we don't want it to be like a crutch where you just auto remediate everything over and over and over and over. We want it to be fix your environment systemically so that it never happens again. Yeah. But we do discuss it. I think what I've found is that customers in a discussion will say they want that thing, but when it goes to actually putting it in place, they very rarely actually use the auto remediation. Yeah. For some, like making sure that production doesn't go down, they're worried about the risks, etc.
Do you ever work in an environment that used a web application firewall?
Yes.
Did you have the experience that like only 20% of the rules that you in theory wanted to implement actually got turned into blocking mode in production?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like what you just described kind of describes or like captures that essence to me where, and I've heard this from organizations, by the way, around the world. This is not a geographic, industry, company size or anything specific. This is nobody wants to be the person responsible for the one false positive block in production that prevented a e-commerce checkout, successful partner transaction, or what have you. And yet I feel like in some way, organizations don't learn to stop making those mistakes unless they actually put constraints on them. I'm curious, like, you worked at two large, fast-moving organizations. How did you think about that in those contexts? Like, did you have to try to put up these walls to force correct behavior?
No.
Okay.
I was lucky.
Okay.
Part luck, part by choice. The executive teams in both Linktree and Atlassian really believed in security.
Okay.
And so that fed through the entire
organization. Yeah.
Exactly. And so if we found something that was wrong, we would go back and fix it.
Yeah.
I think where something like a WAF is really, really good is that first level triage response where like something's bad and it'll take a day or two to fix it. Let's just put something in place to block it temporarily before we do the proper fix.
Yeah.
I think that works. That use case worked really well for us.
Oh, that's interesting because that's not one of the primary blocking use cases that I've observed in customers that I've dealt with, which is the customers that I've dealt with that are able to really implement a blocking rule in production. It's because it's such a universal truth that it's really, really easy. It's like block all traffic from North Korea. Easy. Right? Like that's universally 100% of the time there is no valid business case ever where we would want to allow something. But I find beyond that it gets very fuzzy very fast.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the thing you find with that specific technology, web application firewalls, is that bug bounties show over and over and over again that clever researchers will go find a way around your rule because the rule is so static.
Yeah. Look, I mean, this is something not to flip the conversation, but we work on API security, right, at FireTail. And one of the questions that we run into very often is like, well, why can't I just solve my API security problem with a web application firewall? And to exactly your point, I think it's been proven, I don't know how many times, for anybody interested, look on our blog for why WAFs aren't enough or something like that is the title of the article. And we link 5 instances from the last 6 months, maybe 7 months by now, that prove demonstrably that there are easy workarounds. And it could be as simple as, VPN, cycle IP address, whatever. But more often than not, it's like, oh, actually, it's a business logic flaw. It's not a demonstrable wrong type of call or something that the WAF can pick up. So yeah, I'm consistently surprised that they're not more universally implemented, but also that people go to them and think of them as a solution. And I just see this kind of circular logic flaw where like you can't implement it in production with the blocking that you want, but then you think it's a solution that is demonstrably proven not to solve the problem. Why are we having this conversation? So anyway, a little bit of a tangent there from my side. Yeah. And I want to come back to something from your past experience, which is around incident response and incident communication. And there's something that we've observed in the API security space, which is that APIs are really complex in a way because they kind of sit on a network, so they have some network exposure. They run on top of infrastructure, so there's like infrastructure correlation. They front business logic and application calls, and they usually also front data sets. And so you have like all of these moving parts around them. And when there is a flaw or a breach around an API, organizations really struggle to kind of understand what happened, what the scale of the breach is, and what the scope of the breach is. And so we do things from the product side to try to help simplify that. But I'm curious, as somebody who's worked at some of these organizations operating at scale as a practitioner, how did you think about the whole kind of incident response process? And also importantly, communicating that to key stakeholders, whether that's like the rest of the executive team or to customers, boards, partners, like what's important in that whole process and how do you approach it?
In the investigation,
communications, reporting.
Right.
And I know there's a lot there. So
there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
I think one of the most important things, security incident response differs dramatically to reliability incident response.
Okay.
The most important factor in a reliability incident, like your website's gone down, is to get it back up as quickly as possible. Security is kind of the inverse of that.
Okay.
Is you sacrifice speed to try and deeply understand what's going on so you don't make any bad decisions.
Okay.
So for example, you might find that, an actor got into your environment through something, and your first instinct might be to go immediately block that thing, right? But maybe the actor's been in there for months. Maybe they have persistence mechanisms in a different direction. And what you've done is told them that they now have to exfiltrate as quickly as possible, right? And so what you're really trying to understand is scope the incident before you start making decisions about what to do. The other thing you're trying to do is communicate as fast as you can to your customers what's happened and what they can do to mitigate their risk.
Okay.
So for example, like if their passwords have left the building,
sure.
Okay, those passwords are going to be used by that actor or some other actor in some other environment. And we see this over and over again. One SaaS company gets compromised and the username and password data immediately gets used to attack
every other SaaS company.
With those same users. And so
hackers have automation too. They're going to try this everywhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so like what you want to do is like tell that customer as fast as possible while also making sure you have the information to be able to explain it to them and remediate that incident, contain that incident, all of those fun things.
But there's a couple things in what you said that I want to kind of dig deeper on, because there's some of that runs counterintuitive to, I think, what a lot of us would have experienced as consumers of organizations that have been breached. I think so first of all, there's got to be business pressure to restore services. I know, that's a real thing that everybody faces on a day-to-day basis. And you're saying, like, in a way, you don't want that reaction. You want the time to kind of go do the incident research,
It's a matter of trade-offs.
Okay.
Or it's a matter of where on the spectrum you are. So you absolutely want to go fast.
Yeah.
Like you don't want the actor to be rummaging around your infrastructure for a long period of time. So you still want to do that, but it's not the number one thing. In a reliability thing, it's the absolute number one thing you concentrate on. It's not necessarily the number one thing. Like you want to know exactly what's happened. And you see over and over organizations that rush to put out incident communications. They'll be vague. They'll make some statements about what happened, and then a week later they'll come back and have to retract those statements and explain why they were wrong about these things, and it becomes completely embarrassing. And you have this loop over and over. That's I can think of some.
I can think of some examples as well. Yeah,
exactly. And so you want to avoid that, and you want to avoid the actor taking actions that are going to be detrimental to the whole incident response.
Yeah.
By the fact that they know that they're in there.
But at the same time, we're also entering an era where there's regulatory requirements around the incident reporting, right? And so, in the US, I think 96 hours is 4 days is kind of what's becoming the standard now. And I'm curious, like, I don't know, not to call out any of your past employers, but is that a reasonable time frame, or is there there seems to me that there's still a chance that you're still doing forensics. You may not understand how deeply you might have been compromised and how long you might have been compromised at that point in time.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I think the intent is right.
Yeah.
The pressure on organizations to move fast is right. You want to tell customers, because the other end of the spectrum is you take forever and don't do anything about it and then don't notify customers about everything that's happened. Yeah. And so all of that is right. But on the flip side, sometimes you don't know after 3-4 days what happened. Yeah. And you'll see, like, I've been involved in incident response where it took weeks to unravel everything.
Yeah.
And so, there's definitely a balancing act, and there's sometimes you've got to keep investigating.
So in that case, when you're trying to kind of not lose customer trust, also not lose executive and board support as you're going through weeks of investigation, what's the communication strategy? Because to me, I can see very good reasons why I would remain as unclear and vague and kind of general in everything that I put out to avoid the embarrassment that might come later for getting it wrong.
So, I mean, the employers that I've been at, and my philosophy in particular, has always been try and be as transparent as possible. Don't use weasel words. There is no evidence that is the one that's always used. It's meaningless statement.
There's no evidence that credit cards were compromised.
Exactly. There's no didn't have any logs.
Yeah.
But so it all depends on the exact situation. But like, if the investigation is ongoing, you should say the investigation is ongoing.
Yeah.
If we've taken some actions in the investigation and there's some conclusive results, we should share that. I think that's perfectly reasonable. Especially if there's things that we know customers have to do to mitigate their risk, we should tell them that as soon as possible, whether it's privately through sort of like corporate communications or publicly when
blog
we announce
post, whatever. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of tension there, right? Because the loss of customer trust, the reputational damage, like these are real risks to organization. And recently there was a micro blog. I guess we're not supposed to use the brand name for whatever the stupid bird company used to be called. An up and coming wannabe usurper who had an API that was just like horribly constructed, and we deconstructed it a little bit on our blog if anybody wants to check it out. But it had everything down to password reset codes returned through an API call that was pretty easily obtained, even in an unauthorized manner. Like I could obtain your user record, including password reset codes, which, by the way, were not encrypted, only encoded, and quite easily decoded with open source software. So I could, kind of figure out the email address associated to your account, potentially update it, assert myself as admin, use your reset codes, reset your password, probably take over your account, assume your identity on that platform, and go make statements in your name. And to your point, the communications around it were very much no evidence of this. This is not a real risk. There's no cases of this actually having happened in the wild. But I'm pretty sure for that company, it's got to be close to game over. So like, how do you think about when you've had kind of a worst case scenario, not using weasel words, not backing out, like what's an effective communication strategy in that case?
So the way I've done it in the past is probably the best way to put it, is you've got to have principles that you've agreed on up front.
Okay.
So your comms team, your legal team, your technical security team have agreed on principles like these are going down to these are the words we're not going to use. Like your security is important to us.
Yeah.
Like just avoid those kinds of things. And if you have those principles, if you have those approaches laid out, you can just pull those off the shelf when a bad thing happens. If what you do is try and craft all of the communication at the time of the incident when it's completely chaotic, where you've got maybe hundreds of people working on the incident, you're almost guaranteed to do something silly in the moment. But if you've got those guidelines, principles, templates, etc., you're more likely to make a good decision.
These principles, I'm curious in your experience, are these things that you kind of agreed on in advance with the executive board and with the executive suite and the board?
Yes and no. It depends on the company, how the company functions. Sometimes it's just within the security and legal team. Sometimes it's just with the security and comms team. I've actually had it work where the team has had the principles or the outlines of things, and when something bad has happened and everyone's kind of running around trying to figure out what to say and what to do, we'll provide those things and say, hey, we've already thought about this up front. Use this as a starting point.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Daniel, I know we're kind of running out of time for today's conversation. I wanted to check. I had a list of things that I wanted to ask you here. I'm trying to pick one that we might have like 2-3 minutes to focus on. And there's one that jumps out to me from this list. And this is, I think, a philosophical stance of yours, which is build the security you expect. So when you think about that in some of your past experiences, like, what does that mean to you? And like, what are you trying to say with that?
Yeah, so I'm really big on principles. Right?
Clearly.
If just writing down all of the instructions for everything, I've found in my experience just doesn't work. No, like sometimes people follow the instructions, but often they don't.
Yeah,
so like often what you really want is like really, I guess, trivial or things that people can understand and use. And so at Linktree, for example, we had engineering principles.
Okay.
And one of those principles was build the security you expect. And the idea of that is, okay, you're an engineer or a designer, product manager, whatever, and you're trying to figure out, like, what is this thing going to look like? What's the architecture? What's the design, etc. We have a small security team. You're probably not going to be able to get their expertise, but you want to make good decisions. One of the ways that you can make good decisions is think about, okay, if Google made this thing that we're building, how would I expect it to work? Would I expect the data to be encrypted in the database?
Yeah.
Would I expect it to require me to have a long password?
Yeah.
Whatever the thing is, would I expect them to have logs if there was an incident?
Yeah.
All of those kinds of things. And so like there's a really one trivial thing that you need to remember, and the person can hopefully make better decisions with that principle.
And so do you find that if you put these principles out there and you kind of communicate, educate, get people to commit to them, overall, this should be kind of a self-reinforcing behavior that actually improves the security quality of the organization, both in the products that it's building and in the way that you're kind of thinking about design and operations and incident response and so on.
And yes, and actually what you want it to do is you want it to become a communication tool. So often people find it hard to challenge others in the corporate culture, or maybe hard to challenge their manager or person in authority, right? But if they have a common language that allows them to do that, for example, a principle like this, instead of saying we should encrypt passwords or whatever, we should encrypt this data because it's a good thing to do, you say, well, our principle is build the security we expect, and I expect these kinds of things to be encrypted if Google did, as an example. And so like that common language, if you repeat it enough, actually becomes really powerful, because the security person or the security team can kind of step away and it takes a life of its own.
Yeah. Makes a ton of sense. And by the way, I expect that password to be not only encrypted, but salted with the encryption there one way. So awesome. Well, Daniel Grzelak, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the Modern Cyber Podcast. I've really enjoyed today's conversation. If people want to find out more about you or the work that you're doing, the research, where's the best place?
blog.plerion.com.
All right, you heard it here first. Thanks again. That's it for today's episode. Talk to you next time.
Thanks.